Hello everyone, my name is Jimmy, and today I would like to talk to you about Crystal Eastman, an undeservedly forgotten figure in American socialist history. Paralleling Anna Louise Strong, Crystal Eastman is arguably one of the most underappreciated women in American socialist history. When one thinks of socialist women throughout history, let alone American history, for many, images and writings from figures such as Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, and so many other prominent women from the realm of socialist history and theory would come to mind. Crystal Eastman's name and accomplishments, however, are often absent from leftist discourse, a true shame when one really becomes aware of her efforts and organizing abilities. Consider this an attempt at a biography of Eastman. Consider this an appreciation video. Whatever you consider this essay to be, I hope that at least some of you will benefit and learn something new about socialist history. Let's get into it. Crystal Eastman was born in Marlborough, Massachusetts in the early 1880s, though some sources say that she was born in Glenora, New York. She was raised in, I believe it is pronounced, Canandaigua, New York, her family moving there not long after she was born. Eastman was born to a religious family, with her father Samuel being a congregational minister, and her mother Annis later becoming a school teacher and even a minister herself. Crystal Eastman often cited her mother as one of her main influence into becoming a feminist, as her mother was a pioneer in religious practice, being the first woman to ever be ordained as a congregational minister for Park Church in Elmira, New York. Her mother also, for some time, became the head of the household, as a chronic illness left her father unable to provide for the family for some time. From a young age, before she was even in college, Eastman expressed the necessity for women to maintain a sense of independence and self-reliance, not allowing themselves to become trapped in a patriarchal society that holds women at the behest of men. She expressed this explicitly at a symposium organized by her mother in a paper that was simply entitled Women, and it was this speech that essentially solidified her dedication to the advancement of women not only in the United States, but on an international scale as well. As Eastman became more involved with feminism, this influence helped push her into studying law in college. She graduated from Vassar College in 1903, going on to receive her master's degree in sociology from Columbia University the next year. A few years later, she would go on to earn her degree in law from the New York University School of Law. Upon her completion of law school, she became highly involved in labor law and fighting for protections for the working class. Working on a project for what is known as the Pittsburgh Survey, a project of the Russell Sage Foundation, Eastman and her colleague Paul Kellogg embarked on a 2-month investigation of workplace safety and death in the workplace. The project resulted in the publishing of Work Accidents and the Law in 1910. Witnessing firsthand the destructive nature of capitalism, seeing various workers being unnecessarily injured or even killed on the job, this crystallized her commitment not only to feminism, but to socialism and later anti-militarism. Do you see what I did there? Crystallized, Crystal Eastman, okay, let's move on. Eastman was the first ever female lawyer, of which there were already a scarce amount of at the time, to be so vigorously involved in the labor struggles and the struggles of labor law. After publishing her 1910 report, in addition to the catalyst of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, she went on to draft the very first workers' compensation law in the United States, as a member of the, and this is a very long name for this commission, the New York State Commission of Employees' Liability and Causes of Industrial Accidents, Unemployment, and Lack of Farm Labor. Another pioneering moment in women's development, she was the first woman ever appointed to that position. She would also go on to play a part in the Woodrow Wilson administration, working to further her investigations into workplace safety, advocating for on-site medical care and better general working conditions. As I've said before, from a young age, Crystal Eastman maintained a commitment to the feminist cause, the fight for the emancipation of women from the shackles of patriarchal capitalism. Her commitment to this fight was never declawed, being an integral part of various organizations and movements in her lifetime. Women's suffrage was one of the many movements that she took part in to ensure the betterment of women. In the battle for women to have the right to vote, Eastman, along with suffragists such as Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, founded what was known as the Congressional Union. The Congressional Union would go on to evolve into the relatively recently dissolved National Woman's Party. Not long before the NWP's founding, Eastman divorced from her first husband, Wallace Benedict, in 1915. Her divorce was, at least in part, carried out so that she could engage more thoroughly in the struggle for the emancipation of women and the general working class. In true fashion to her dedication to women's equality, Crystal Eastman made a decision regarding her divorce that, at the time, it was a rarity. After her divorce, Eastman absolutely refused to accept any form of alimony from her ex-husband. Some may ask why she refused the money, because, well, considering that it's, in essence, free money. Well, she refused this alimony because she saw accepting it as being dependent on a man, and Eastman saw women's independence in both the public and domestic realms as vital for establishing genuine women's equality. Eastman's participation in the battle for women's suffrage and women's rights in general culminated in the passing of two incredibly historically significant amendments, respectively. Although the struggle for women's suffrage in Wisconsin that Eastman was involved with never particularly took off, her later campaign saw, generally speaking, much better results. The 19th Amendment, ratified in August of 1920, granted women in the United States, white women in particular really, but in rhetoric, it granted women the right to vote. While Eastman did support the passing of the 19th Amendment, seeing it as a marginal victory for the emancipation of women, she recognized that gaining the right to vote was only the tip of the iceberg in the struggle for equality. In an article written for The Liberator, which we will get into a little bit later, titled "Now We Can Begin," Eastman explained that the emancipation of women could not fully blossom with this singular accomplishment. How this fight was expanded, at least by Eastman, will be covered a bit later on. Crystal Eastman is also credited as one of the original people to help in drafting the Equal Rights Amendment, something that has been agitated for decades. However, the amendment has never been picked up on a federal level. In spite of the failure to have the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, Eastman never ceased in her fight to break the shackles of capitalism's patriarchal structure, taking on issues in the women's movement that often went unaddressed at the time, primarily due to a good portion of the feminist movement focusing too greatly on suffrage. Beyond the battle for suffrage and fighting to have the Equal Rights Amendment ratified, Eastman engaged in a multi-fronted battle for women's self-determination and bodily autonomy. Abhorring the very idea of women being controlled by the whim of men, Eastman was a staunch advocate of advancing the scientific understanding of birth control and making access to birth control a vital right for all women, arguing that women should be able to establish economic dependence while simultaneously being able to embrace the traditionally feminine prospects such as motherhood. Eastman states in her work, Birth Control and the Feminist Program, that one of the most significant aspects of building such an independence is for women to be able to have control over when they have children, if they even choose to have children. As she states in the aforementioned piece, and I quote, "Birth control is an elementary essential in all aspects of feminism." She would further state, "We want our children to be deliberate, eagerly called into being when we are at our best, not crowded upon us in times of poverty and weakness." Eastman also collaborated with Emma Goldman on many issues concerning birth control and other aspects of bodily autonomy, including, according to the Vassar College Encyclopedia, the legalization of prostitution. Legalizing sex work was something that at the time was rarely, if ever, addressed in American feminism, at least to my understanding. A pacifist in her revolutionary convictions, Part of Crystal Eastman's struggle against the mechanisms of capitalism was her devoted opposition to militarism and imperialism, particularly in the USA's involvement in the 1916 Mexican War, along with World War I. A founding member of the Women's Peace Party, the party that would eventually evolve into the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Eastman and her comrades would go on to lobby for the U.S. to cease the profiteering of arms manufacturing, conscription, general imperialist endeavors, and military interventionism in Europe, Central America, and such. In line with the socialist position, particularly that of the analysis of Lenin, Eastman's crusade against the war is rooted in the recognition of the First World War as an unnecessary war of imperialism. A culmination of their vehement opposition to U.S. involvement in World War I, Eastman, alongside Roger Baldwin, Norman Thomas, and many others dedicated to anti-imperialism and anti-militarism, founded the National Civil Liberties Bureau. Her second husband, Walter Fuller, whom Eastman married in 1916, was also greatly involved in these struggles. The NCLB's primary purpose was to defend those who expressed discontent with the war. In line with Eastman's commitment to a revolutionary pacifism and anti-imperialism, the NCLB basically served to protect the rights of those who were forcefully silenced by their government for their opposition to imperialist interventionism. Eastman would be one of the primary lawyers in this mission, consistently reaffirming her commitment to the pursuit of genuine equality for all people. Aiming to defend the Bill of Rights, something that the U.S. was actively violating both before and during their entering the war, Eastman states that the primary reason for defending anti-war dissenters was, and I quote, to maintain something over here that would be worth coming back to when the weary war was over. The legacy of the NCLB has by no means faded, as the organization would go on to reform itself as the ACLU, otherwise known as the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU carries on a variety of the goals and struggles that Eastman engaged in during her time with the NCLB/ACLU. If you recognize the name Eastman, it's because Crystal is actually the sister of Max Eastman. If you don't know who Max Eastman was, he was basically a Trotskyist who turned into a right-winger later in his life. The two siblings would go on to work together editing and writing for the socialist magazine The Liberator in the late 1910s and early 1920s, before the first Red Scare ultimately ruined the prospects of continuing to publish the revolutionary magazine. Unfortunate circumstances only followed with the dissolving of The Liberator, as the Red Scare culture fostered in the U.S. as a response to the Bolshevik Revolution ultimately led to Crystal Eastman's decline, both career-wise and for her life in general. As the first Red Scare raged on, and The Liberator faced both financial and political trouble, Crystal Eastman found herself in a situation similar to that of The Liberator itself, in that the political climate of the time and the financial issues that were built off of that climate saw her ability to find work in the United States drastically reduced. A victim of the anti-communist Palmer raids after World War I, which was part of a program that was essentially COINTELPRO before COINTELPRO, Eastman and numerous comrades found themselves unable to effectively continue their fight in the United States, either due to being arrested or being blacklisted. For Eastman, it was the latter. Eastman's prospects for paid work only came from working with a very small handful of feminist journals, and she was otherwise blacklisted from employment due to the state-sanctioned anti-communist discrimination. Eastman went on to live in England periodically, both in order to find work and be with her husband, traveling between England and the U.S. numerous times, and ultimately resettling in the U.S. with her husband in 1927. Soon after their return, however, her husband died. The following year, on July 8th of 1928, Eastman herself would die at age 47 from nephritis, which is essentially a very strong inflammation of the kidneys. Many of Crystal Eastman's ideas were ahead of their time, practicing a form of what would now be called intersectionality before intersectionality was even formulated. Eastman had a way of intertwining the struggle of women's rights, the struggles of the working class, and the anti-imperialist struggle in a matter that at the time was foreign to so many, at least in the United States. She aimed to expand the fight of the women's movement beyond solely fighting for suffrage. She aimed to fight for equal pay and reproductive rights in simultaneous fashion with the revolutionary pacifism that she exhibited in her opposition to World War I and the imperialist causes. She sought the emancipation of both men and women workers from the exploitative practices of capitalism and the stranglehold of domestic servitude. Crystal Eastman believed that women should have a legitimate say in whether or not they have children. She believed that women should be an integral component in the fight against imperialist aggression. She believed in socialism. Crystal Eastman is a figure that by no means deserves to be forgotten to history, swept under the rug, left to the margins of history. Eastman's contributions to the socialist, feminist, and pacifist struggles for peace and liberation are things that we as communists should study and try to learn from. In the year 2000, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, New York, a much-deserved honor for a revolutionary woman who was far ahead of her time. I would like to end this video with a quote from renowned poet and writer Claude McKay, who was a dear friend and colleague of Crystal Eastman. As stated upon learning of her death, Crystal Eastman was a great-hearted woman whose life was big with primitive and exceptional gestures. She never wrote that book of woman which was imprinted on her mind, and so life was cheated of one contribution about women that no other woman could write. That, my friends, has been the life of Crystal Eastman. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe to Midwestern Marks. If you, like me, you want to see more of what I do, maybe you could check out my channel as well. Anywho, my name is Jimmy from Midwestern Marks. Thank you for watching.